difficult question, and it's the kind of question that often causes parents to respond with absolute, I would say, terror, fear, recoiling. What have I done wrong? How does my child not believe in God? He's been raised in a home in which God language, belief, practice, following the Torah has been instilled in him or her from a very young age. How did this happen? So I think first and foremost, recoiling or saying, responding angrily or fearfully is not the best approach. I think anyone who has children who are growing up in a postmodern world where children are exposed to limitless choices in terms of beliefs and thoughts and differences, have to be prepared for the moment this question is going to come in any variance. Meaning, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in halakha, I don't believe in Torah, and so on and so forth. Raising children to be religious today is particularly challenging because one of the biggest enforcers in religious belief and practice, or at least in practice, was the social community, was the very rigid boundaries within a community, which essentially prevented someone from asking too many questions, or they would be thrown out. And we see some of that in the Haredi, and particularly in the Hasidic communities, where the social models are very, very strong. And so the type of education is much more uniform, the type of dress is much more uniform, and the price of breaking with that uniformity is really often to have to leave the community. In modern Orthodoxy, we raise our children in modernity. And so children are exposed to ideas that threaten their belief. They're exposed to reading materials, to short stories, to history, to science. And so it shouldn't really surprise us when a child comes back and asks a question about God, because God is a belief, God is a concept, God is something that we feel within ourselves. But of course, we can't prove that God exists. I mean, this has been an attempt of philosophers for thousands of years. Can we prove God exists? And the reality is there's no absolute proof. There's only a sense. And that's why within religious communities, we believe in God and we worship God and we aspire to a relationship with God. But we also have many atheists who essentially have rejected God in favor of science and rational thought and so on. So I would first and foremost suggest that parents already begin to think at an much earlier age than a boy at 15. How am I going to answer this question? Why do I believe in God? Once a parent can already articulate something of that nature, they can begin to have a conversation. Conversation could be, well, why don't you believe in God? I believe in God because of X. Over and over, I think parents have to try to have conversations with their children that they're most afraid of. God is a conversation, even within religious community, we're very afraid of. We take for granted that God exists and that we believe in God, but we very rarely articulate why we believe in God or what that means or what God represents. And finding your own language to do so will give you much more credibility and will allow you to listen to your child. I will also say that you can't force your child to believe in God. That's not something that's really possible. If a child has come to the conclusion, and again, are we talking about a 14-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 22-year-old? Obviously, there are different ages in which we have more ability to help a child rethink and reframe. And sometimes we have to acknowledge that with all of our best efforts and the rabbis and the educators and the peer groups, whatever it is, a child sometimes rejects a belief system. So I think, again, it is helpful if a parent begins to think about how am I going to handle my child rejecting my belief system before it happens. And usually there are signs. Usually it doesn't come from nothing. I think, again, in this conversation, one can suggest, well, again, why don't you believe in God? I'd like to know a little bit about what your thought process is. I'd like to share with you why I believe in God. Would it be helpful if we think about how to look for answers together? Are you interested in answers and in finding maybe a different way of relating to this issue? Becoming a partner in the child's quest or the child's journey, so the child feels that he or she can come home with whatever it is they're asking and be open and candid. And I think that sometimes children outgrow that stage. Sometimes, again, it's a way of taunting the parent. Well, I don't believe in God. What is this anyway? And they're just trying to see how the parent responds. And so I think rather than being reactive, it's often best to be proactive and try to think of, where am I going to look? Am I going to look in Midrash? Am I going to look in the Torah? Am I going to look in philosophy? What would my child respond to? Could I think of someone my child might be able to talk to? If my child is rejecting God because of science, maybe finding a religious scientist who represents the ultimate in science and rational thought and yet is a practicing Orthodox Jew. If it's biblical criticism that the child's discovered, then again, finding a religious Bible scholar who might be able to help the child think more deeply about what they're saying and what they're believing, and giving them frames of reference that they hadn't thought of.